Welcome to this Mtech Access webinar. At Mtech Access, we provide health economics and outcomes research and market access services from strategy through to implementation. Our unique NHS relationships guide and validate everything we do in the UK. We work with over 80 NHS associates to bring our pharmaceutical and medtech clients authentic insights into the NHS. We can help you answer key questions related to the NHS, from how to communicate with integrated care systems, places and primary care networks, to how to capture pathways of care. Get in touch today to discuss your market access goals. First though, I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this Mtech Access webinar. I'm Robert Hull. I'm a senior consultant to the Mtech Access within the NHS Insights and Interactions team. And today we're going to be having a webinar which we've called 6 areas of the UK health policy for Medtech to pay attention to. Before we kick off, just sort of a couple of house rules. So unfortunately, we're unable to take sort of verbal questions, but there is a chat running. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please do pop them in the chat and we'll try and pick those up as we go through the session and sort of answer them if we can. We've got a sort of question and answer format, and sort of at the end of each section, if we sort of feel it's appropriate and we have the time, then we'll take some of those questions from the audience. And if we have some time at the end, we'll also try and answer some questions there. For those of you who don't know Mtech Access very well, we're a specialist health economics, outcomes and market access consultancy with a strong track record in expert delivery. We provide a lot of specialist support to pharmaceutical and medtech clients, and we work as a collaborative partner with the NHS, both sort of with them and for them, sort of going backwards and forth there. But today we're focusing on medtech and sort of the evolving policy and regulatory landscape for these technologies with a focus on, as I said, those 6 areas that would be really good to pay attention to if you're in medtech at the moment. And I'm really delighted and excited to welcome our guest today. This is Bill Lee from the British Healthcare Trades Association. And he's here to provide us with some expert insight into this really exciting but rapidly changing areas of policy and regulation. So hello and welcome, Bill. Would you be able to take a moment to introduce yourself in the BHTA?
Yeah, absolutely. Very pleased to be here, Rob, and very pleased to be speaking to the Mtech Access audience. As Rob says, my name is Bill Lee. You can hear from the sound of my voice that I'm American. Don't worry, I've lived here for 20 years, so I think every time I think I've just about got everything there is to know to learn about the UK, test cricket reemerges, and I know that we're in the midst of that. So please bear with me, but you know, all by way of saying I feel like a cultural Brit, if you know, an American by birth. The British Healthcare Trades Association, of which I am the head of policy and compliance, is a trade organization that was founded in 1917 to look after the needs and interests of soldiers returning with life-changing injuries from the Great War, and that makes us one of Britain's older trade associations, and we've expanded now and changed over the years into you know, what is more traditionally recognizable as a trade association, looking after manufacturers, distributors, and resellers of retailers rather of assistive technology and health tech in the you know, in the mobility space and in the assistive technology space. So that's everything from stoma and continence products through to mobility scooters and powered wheelchairs, many items that are medical devices, and therefore the new medical device regulatory regime is something that our members are, you know, consistently interested in. I've been at BHTA since June of 2021. My previous health tech experience comes from working at the Quango and UK central government level in special projects teams that helped bioscience and research organizations deal with violent extremism. And before that, I had a career in research and advocacy across a number of fronts, most prominently helping survivors of the Holocaust and their families get back bank accounts, insurance policies, and art that had been stolen by the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So every time I think to myself, well, the UK regime is complicated, then I think back and think, but you know, there are more complicated things. But it's that perspective that I am bringing to the regulatory piece of things. So delighted to talk to you today about, you know, what this landscape looks like.
Thank you. So it's a really interesting career. I'm glad that our regulatory regime is less complicated than some things. This gives us some succor. Before we sort of dive into these 6 areas, I just wondered, would you be able to sort of run over maybe some of the key challenges that you see that medtech companies consistently face, sort of from your role in the BHTA?
Absolutely, yeah. We, like many trade associations, we survey our, you know, members on a semi-regular basis. You know, I think it would surprise nobody on this call to know that, you know, 9 out of 10 of our members, when we surveyed them in the autumn of last year, said that they were facing, you know, extraordinary financial pressure. Fully a third of them said that some of the pressures that they were facing, or rather the pressures that they were facing, were enough to make them consider leaving the UK market or deprioritizing the UK market in favor of other easier to negotiate regulatory landscapes, market access landscapes. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. You know, certainly production costs, if you're a manufacturer, UK manufacturers have absorbed around about a 20 to 25% increase in raw materials if you look at the last 5 years. If you're not a manufacturer, if you're a distributor, you know, you face very much more expensive and frankly complex distribution channel costs and administration. No one needs reminding about the rise of shipping container costs across 2020 and 2021. You know, that saw shipping container prices shoot up by as much as 800%. I think another across the board issue that we hear quite a lot is the cost of staffing. And, you know, with ONS figures showing between a 15 and 20% rise in weekly earnings since 2017 fairly consistently, you know, that is a major issue for many of our members. UK inflation, again, I don't want to give anyone hives by talking about inflation, but you know, although it's creeping back down, you know, UK inflation at record levels is certainly not helping that staffing cost piece. And finally, you know, I think one of the most commonly mentioned pieces of overhead expense is, of course, the cost of energy. I think this too is changing for the better, although not, you know, as quickly as anyone would like. And indeed, you know, we have spoken to some manufacturers who were exploring things like purchasing industrial natural gas powered generators because of their belief that it was cheaper to make their own electricity rather than to buy it. That is an extreme case, and I don't want to be, you know, making the logical error of arguing the general from the particular, but I think, you know, the fact that anyone is considering that, you know, does speak to the severity of the problem. So I think that's kind of the general, you know, that's a handful of factors that affect industry in general, and medtech in particular. I think as well for medtech in particular, there are some really vexing and interesting questions that we're going to get into in our discussion of the 6 areas around things like sustainability and social value. And I think the use of plastics is something that's particularly, you know, of interest for medtech. But that's a sort of flavor of the general background.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I don't want to dwell too much on the more systemic issues, but if anybody sort of from medtech background is listening at the moment and is thinking, well, you know, I identify with these challenges, I understand them. Is that the sort of thing they should be coming to the BHTA with, maybe for a little bit of advice or guidance?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, I think one of the strengths of the BHTA, as with, you know, any membership organization, is the ability to, you know, put people in touch to talk about how this problem is being addressed in a variety of ways. So one of the things that our members regard, I think, as most helpful is, the creation and the facilitation of a safe space to have some dialogue about how, different companies are approaching this differently. And there are different ways to approach it. I mean, there are particular approaches that an SME might take with regard to sustainability and social value that will be different to the approach of a large corporate. Likewise, there are things that if you're a small company, you are not going to be able to do to defray, for instance, some of the systemic economic factors. So I'm thinking specifically here of things like transfer pricing or the movement of costs, between operational units. But absolutely, Rob, I think the power of the BHTA, its membership lies in members being able to say, yeah, this is really vexing, and here's one way that we've approached that. I can't think of anyone who would even get close to saying they think they figured it all out. And I think everyone feels like they have quite a lot to learn.
Yeah, it's definitely a very challenging landscape. To sort of dive into those 6 then key areas, I think it leads on quite nicely. I think it's fair to say that the medtech regulatory regime in the UK, I think we say it's an evolving landscape, but it's sort of every couple of weeks paradigms shift and the ground moves underneath us. So there's been CE marking and UK CE marking and how those deadlines have been changing them. Would you have any advice, or maybe expand on that, and any advice sort of for medtech companies? How do they position themselves so they can make sure that their current and future products or technologies are going to meet those regulatory hurdles as soon as possible, or maybe anticipate what the MHRA might be doing next if such a thing is possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to set the background, we'll certainly kick off with that piece that is the regulatory piece. Just to give you a preview of the 6 areas, really the first of those 6, as Rob says, that we're going to talk about is regulating for safe, effective UK medical devices. The second is about regularizing sustainability and social value. Third is around releasing NHS capacity, specifically industry partnership, for effective health and social care delivery. The fourth is around rethinking procurement. The fifth is around rethinking innovation adoption. And the sixth is around reducing export barriers. So 6 R's for lack of a more artful term. And the first R, Rob, as you said, that's absolutely vexing people, I think, to a degree that, certainly I have not seen in the UK before now, and I struggle to think of a time in the US when I worked with state and federal governments in the US. I can't think of a time when the regulatory landscape has been more uncertain. I think the first thing to recognize, and the first thing for medtech companies to, from the regulatory standpoint, to communicate outside just the specialist regulatory team, is the sheer uniqueness and complexity of the issue right now. And what I mean by that is that right now, and for, one could argue, the foreseeable future, there is no single law, regulation, or market access route for UK medical devices. In a very real way, UK medical devices and the regulation that governs their sale exists in a sort of past, present, future state that will only, become more complicated and deliver unwanted results for patients, for NHS, for social care systems, as well as for UK PLC, unless industry, in partnership with the regulator, MHRA, plots a very careful course. And of course, this is a fantastic example, something else that I think regulatory professionals can do well to remind their other corporate colleagues. This is a great example of the box of things that you can control being, a matchbox compared to the lorry load of things that you can't control. So I think the first thing, one of the first steps that companies, we see successful companies taking with their approach to regulation is identifying the factors that are within their control. And the first of those is really identifying, well, what does the landscape currently look like? So we at BHTA have worked quite a lot ourselves and in partnership with other trade associations to, create guides, templates, pieces of collateral that explain, what the landscape looks like and how to progress through it. So the currently applicable, UK law of the land is the UK Medical Device Regulations 2002 and its amendments, and that is the piece of secondary legislation in the UK that enacted EU MDD, or the EU Medical Devices Directive. That, as listeners here and anyone who has had the privilege of working with medical device regulation for the last few years will know, that is the subject of a lot of change and a lot of discussion. MHRA has consulted on this in the autumn of 2021 and is in the process of reforming the UK medical device regime. So the second thing that's important to remember is that although UK MDR 2002 is the applicable sort of UK law of the land at the moment, there are market access provisions in the EU medical device regulation, or EU MDR, which have to be taken into account for market access purposes in the UK. And really there we're talking about the things that allow a medical device manufacturer to put a CE mark on their product. And the UK regime in the form of MHRA has, I think, we in the trade association world would like to think with our help, but maybe sometimes in spite of our insistence, they have made concessions that see, some transition deadlines that mean that the CE mark will be accepted in the UK until until quite some time from now. So between 2028 and 2030, depending on the class of UK medical device. So currently applicable law of the land, UK MDR, but have to take into account EU MDR for market access purposes. And that, again, is while we're awaiting the continued what I would call the continued operationalization of future UK regulations via the MHRA. Now, those are going to require per market in the UK a UKCA mark for GB, a CE mark for any product that's sold in the EU or Northern Ireland, and finally, in some circumstances for Northern Ireland, a UK NI mark. So any of those three marks, unless the medical device is of the simplest kind, that is class 1 medical device, which doesn't require third-party assessment, but can be declared in a declaration of conformity by the manufacturer itself. Unless it's that simple class 1 medical device, any of those marks, obtaining any of those marks, has to involve a conformity assessment body or an approved body here in the UK, and in the EU, those are EU notified bodies. And there are a finite group of those companies. Again, people on this call will need no reminding that it's not like there's an unlimited supply of those kinds of companies. And one of the things that we would encourage companies to do, and we've seen the more successful companies in our membership do, is to really communicate early and often with your existing approved body, whether that is a UK approved body or an EU notified body, because capacity at those bodies is a serious issue, and it's something that we and other trade associations have been working with MHRA quite a bit to hammer home in terms of the importance of transitional arrangements being as lenient as possible. So all of that's a very sort of long lead in to saying, I think the first piece of dealing with all of this uncertainty is identifying the things about which you can be certain. I think that when it comes to keeping abreast of the changes that are certain to come down the pike. Again, BHTA, along with our other trade association colleagues, try very hard to keep our various memberships, informed. I think one of the things that we're trying to work on with MHRA, and this isn't just an MHRA problem, although I would argue it's particularly acute in MHRA, is recognizing the reality of corporate, the ability of corporations to move when you announce a change. That is, one thing that corporations and the markets that they make up don't like is uncertainty. And we have been really pressing MHRA quite hard to say, here is our roadmap to what the future medical device regime will look like. Here are the times when we anticipate making changes. Here are the areas where we can't predict with any certainty. And here's what the end state should look like. Now, I would say that MHRA is getting much better at doing that. I would just as strongly say that I think, and I don't think MHRA is unique in this regard. This has been a difficult journey, to use the American word, for government over the last, 24 to let's say 36 months. And I think I think anyone in a regulatory function would do well to make plans now that sort of for the corporation and from an internal company standpoint, can be flexed to deal with whatever shape the government might take in the near future. Our conversations with those who are much closer to the political grindstone than we are, indicate it will come as a shock to nobody that it's going to be an interesting 18 to 24 months in UK political terms. So I think companies having a plan that is flexible enough to deal with whatever that government looks like and whatever that regulatory regime might look like is and that's a pretty obvious and non-controversial thing to say. But for instance, at BHTA, one of the things that we've built for our members is a guide for registering medical devices in the UK that sets out at a very fundamental level, here are the steps that you have to go through, from defining whether something actually is a medical device, to figuring out which class it is, to figuring out exactly what kind of marking you have to put on it based on its risk classification and based on the law under which you are declaring compliance. And unfortunately, I think that there is, in this regard, when it comes to policy right now, I don't think there are a great number of shortcuts. I think you actually kind of have to do the homework so that you're ready. That said, I think MHRA really wants to, it sounds to me from our interactions with them, like they really want to return to the days when they were regarded as very pragmatic and very sort of straightforward. That is, when they were one of 28 competent authorities. I think the challenge they face right now is sticking the landing on the move from being one of 28 competent authorities to being a sovereign regulator in your own right is a very difficult thing to pull off.
But I guess maybe the key takeaway, if I'm pulling that out there, is just engage early and stay up to date with that landscape. So making sure that you've contacted your regulatory authorities and you're in the queue if you need to be, in order to have your device assessed, and do that well ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the good news is, as I say, for the vast majority of class 1 medical devices, that is devices don't need third-party involvement. You have as a company more control because you are the one responsible for keeping the technical file. I think even if you do work with a notified body or an approved body, because you have a class 2 or above device, as you say, Rob, interacting with them early and often is definitely the way to go. I think the three things that are really important to remember about the landscape right now, as we know it, is the new UK medical device regime is planned to come into effect on the 1st of July 2025. And the transitional arrangements state, roughly speaking, the following. For devices that are CE marked under EU MDR, that is medical devices CE marked under EU MDR, those can stay on the GB market without a UKCA mark. That's the new mark that will be required under the UK regime until the 1st of July 2030. So that's up to 5 years after the new regulations take effect. The second transitional arrangement says that devices that are CE marked under EU MDD can stay on the GB market without a UKCA mark, so with their existing CE mark, until the sooner of one of two things. Either the current CE certificate expires, or for 3 years after the new regulations take effect. So that takes us out to the 1st of July 2028.
Thank you.
I think those are the really important landmarks from the regulatory standpoint. I think that to the degree that companies are comfortable talking about how this complicates their decision making, for those that are working with consultants, regulatory colleagues at trade bodies, I think communicating really clearly what it means for you as a company to lack a clear, sensible, consistent roadmap for the new UK medical device regime, a clear, consistent, sensible timeline. Worries about classification disputes, that is, where the MHRA might have a different view on the classification of an object. Is it a class 1 device? Is it class 1 or class 2? Versus, let's say, a sister regulator in the EU. And I think to the degree that companies are comfortable sharing how frustrating that is, there can never be too many examples for government to listen to. And I think that, when the sort of silver lining that I would point to is that when we as a trade association have made those kinds of representations to MHRA on behalf of our members, in all but a vanishingly rare handful of cases, they've done the sensible thing. It's I think what we struggle with, and what many companies struggle with, is that's not a very scalable way to, if every time you have to write a special email saying, look.
Yeah, it's just not cost effective, or time effective rather.
Correct.
But yeah, to move us to our next topic, just to make sure we have the time for all 6. So we've got the regulatory picture is moving, but also sort of the emphasis that the NHS has been placing on social value, sustainability, and sort of value-based procurement has been really increasing. We're sort of seeing that sort of through the initiatives like the net zero agenda. What are the key messages that you would say to Medtech companies that they should be trying to convey to the NHS to sort of have the best chance of having their product taken up?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting piece of discussion, and the reason one of the things I think makes it so interesting is that this is relatively new for all of the participants in this process. It's new for the NHS. It's definitely new for supply chain, NHS supply chain, that is, and it can be new for many companies. I think what we hear from our membership is the work that the NHS in particular has done around saying, look, here is how we define sustainability. Here's how we define social value. Is quite good, and that's work that's going on via things like the NHS Sustainable Supplier Forum. If you're a supplier to the NHS and that's not something that you've heard of, please feel free to drop us an email after this, and we can tell you how to get involved with that. I think when it comes to implementing the 2 policy procurement notes that govern the cross-governmental approach to sustainability and social value, and that's PPN 0620 and PPN 0621. The NHS has actually done quite a good job at saying, here's what we expect. And really what they expect is that, on a sliding timescale, companies will start to share the burden of their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions in the sustainability piece, and will make positive moves to responsible social value at the same time. I think all of that is the good news. I think the challenging news is that what we see and hear is that there is still a less than consistent application of scoring and weighting of sustainability and social value across the NHS. So you might have one trust that scores and weights social value in a certain way, or you might have one framework agreement, all right, that scores and weights sustainability and social value in a certain way. And we as a trade association have really been concentrating a lot of our effort in saying to government, look, in the form of things like the NHS Sustainable Supplier Forum, the NHS Central Commercial Function, and I think this is an interesting note for those who've been around the NHS long. The NHS has only had a central commercial function for a little over a year and a half, and sustainability and social value are cited within that function. It's the same function that also governs NHS supply chain. So from an organizational standpoint, this is, I think, a statement of how important they deem this. What we have been saying is, look, there are a lot of good efforts going on there. You need to now put some real resource behind that. And you need to say this central commercial function and the sustainability and supply and social value program that they're running, they have the power to not just invite trusts to participate, but to be a little bit more instructive. And that, again, those of you who've worked with the NHS for much longer than I have need no reminding that the tension between the command and control element of a national approach and the flexibility at the local trust or ICS level, skinning, if we skin that cat, then we've done something quite miraculous. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I am saying that that is an area, that we as a trade association are focused on. I think for companies, the thing that they can do is really, again, either working with a trade association like BHTA, possibly working with some consultants, and really I think some careful internal thought. There are quite a lot of things that companies either already are doing or can do relatively easily that can fall under the sustainability or social value banner. And I think it's important to think about what one very senior NHS England sustainability executive said to our membership at our conference around this time last year, September of 2022. And that is that the NHS position is not, here is a box ticking exercise, here is, something for you, here are a bunch of hoops for you to jump through. But really, why explain, if you really believe this becoming sustainable and having a modern approach to social value doesn't make business sense, the rejoinder from NHS is, well, we think it does.
It does now.
It does now. And if you want to do business with us, we'd like to hear why you believe it makes good sense. I think what we, again, at trusts and within NHS supply chain frameworks that are functioning at what we would consider to be the most productive level, there is an interest in hearing about how companies do this, on an individual basis. So there may be some things that your company is doing, that are really valuable that might not quite fit in, one tiny box of definition, but indeed, do excite a response. So I think, understanding, and again, this can be done through your trade association. It can be, hopefully it can be done more and more in direct conversation with procurement officials, but really explaining some of your efforts, your corporate efforts, and making sure that, you're getting credit for some things that you might already be doing, that just haven't been sort of calculated under the banner of sustainability or social value, but could very well be. And we work with, again, one of the things that BHTA is going to be calling for in a sort of, we would like this, no matter what stripe the government is, is a national stakeholder forum to share some of this best practice, because what I do see often is sometimes a particular trust or a particular ICS will have a really good idea, and the minute that another trust or another ICS figures that out, everyone wants to copy that. And
Yeah.
again, the NHS central commercial functions, and one of the major things that they're trying to do is identify those opportunities, those efficiencies, those nifty things that are going on, and figure out how to deploy them at scale across the NHS.
It's always that tension between what's sort of the national view and how you can implement that effectively on the ground. And I think I'll be really excited, for that if and when that forum becomes part of it. I'll be very interested to hear what they have to say and to take part. I think it'd just be good to understand it, because at the moment our understanding is that you go to one place and they'll have one set of understandings of how net zero works and what they should be counting, and go somewhere else and it's very different. But I guess in terms of another problem that's sort of on the list of things that may have a more local impact, or has to be worked out more locally anyway, is capacity and challenges with effective health. So we hear about urgent care, patient flow, and discharge, and that we're still hearing about those, and it hasn't gone away for as long as I can remember. So I guess the question this is next on my list is why are these still priority issues? Why have they not been addressed? And what can medtech companies be doing to signal that they can be maybe part of the solution there? And I think it all links into social care as well, which I don't think anybody's cracked yet. But how can medtech companies basically address the capacity challenge within the NHS and ensure that their social care packages are suitable for use in the NHS?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think it's one of the things that makes right now a fascinating time to be alive and considering this, is that integration of health and social care, have been the subject of so much attention in the form of green papers, white papers, government statements, that and at a very fundamental level. I mean, if you look at what the government has said about the move to ICSs, from CCGs to ICSs, essentially what they're part of what they're trying to do is drive organizationally a set of efficiencies that will allow more flexibility at the local level, and should, in theory, if done right, allow more integration of health and social care budgets. I don't think for a moment that that's a simple task or easily done, and BHTA and others have been trying to hold them, the government, to account on this, because in some ways, the metaphor that I've always used is, you're shrinking from several hundred CCGs to 42 ICSs. So that's a centralization move. So the sponge of your cake is centralized, but all of your communications says that this is to promote local flexibility. So you're frosting your centralization sponge with a federated buttercream, right? Which is a difficult trick to pull off. But I think that the first, the one of the first things to think about for health and social care companies is and health tech in this space is really to hold the NHS and the government to account to some things that they've said very publicly. And we've heard for about 2 years NHS leaders getting up at public forums saying there is no way that the modern NHS can deliver without strong partnership with industry. We cannot do this without our suppliers. And I think that all you need to do is keep in mind a statistic, something like, this happens to be one of my favorites. Here we are living in a time where the lifespan of the NHS, 75 years, is now longer than the average healthy life expectancy of UK adults, according to the latest global burden of disease study, 68.9 years, right? So the NHS is now outliving the healthy lifespan of UK adults, and UK adults are can be expected to spend between 12 and 12 and a half years living with illness or disability. So I think that top line is the place to start, and then I think tying some of the things that that companies can do to things that are very hard for the NHS. It would be very hard for them to look this gift horse in the mouth, for instance. So think about things like workforce expansion. There are some BHTA members working in various of our sections. That's what we call the different parts of our membership. So I'm thinking here of, in particular, our prosthetics and orthotics companies. They are investing a great deal in the training and future of health and social care professionals in their area, prosthetists, orthotists, and specialist occupational therapists. So whether that's sponsoring more school places, expanding postgraduate training programs, and all with an eye toward better recruitment, training, and retention of these folks. That's one way that they can positively influence the workforce struggle that the NHS is currently having. I think staffing flexibility. If you look at the things that the NHS says about staffing flexibility, we have some members of our independent living, mobility, and stairlifts and access companies that during the pandemic, developed what amounts to essentially a brand new care pathway. I mean, it's a little bit overblown to call it that, but what they did was to develop virtual assessments, a way to do assessments for equipment that would be used in someone's home via a video call. And this not only reduced burden on the NHS, but ensured that patients and carers still could get these technologies. This was at the height of the pandemic, at a time when there was a huge community care backlog. Estimates range from 750,000 to 900,000 people in 2021 were waiting for these kinds of things. So I think there, again, are things that companies might be doing already in terms of a move to the virtual world that you should look at and think about when you're thinking about really helping the NHS to help itself. I think that extends to things like technology adoption, and this doesn't have to be particularly fancy. So for instance, we have some community equipment suppliers who are using it would be going too far to call it a telehealth solution. It's really a quite nuanced and sophisticated automated calling system that has driven a huge uptick in the return of community equipment like crutches, wheelchairs. This often gets forgotten, and a trust can find itself out of pocket when in fact a lot of the stuff isn't being used anymore. It just hasn't been returned. So I think those are at the easier end. I think at the more sophisticated end, you have things like the possibility of partnering with the NHS. So for instance, we have a company that has pulled forward essentially a re-ablement program. So this is physical therapy and equipment trialing into the hospital. And it's led in their particular area to a 42% reduction in per patient days per stay. And it's impressed this particular NH trust that they're rolling it out at all of the hospitals within their trust. And again, that's something that this company developed, with an eye toward serving their customers more quickly and in a way that reflected their customers' needs, more accurately. And then I think there are things that can be done that if you are involved, for instance, in if you're an existing supplier on an NHS framework, for instance, I think there are things that you can do from within that framework, whether that's for instance, talking about if it's, let's say, a service to provide mattresses to an NHS trust, right? There are a number of steps in that plan that a company who's trying to operate that service at a profit can identify that it can probably streamline things in ways that the NHS might not necessarily think of on their own. So I think that I would be very surprised if conversation partners at the NHS alongside any of the people on this call today, would sort of turn away from those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. My next question was around sort of, how medtech companies can understand the sort of, what basically their customers need. But I think you covered that pretty well. It's really important to understand who your market is, what sort of questions they're going to be asking, and and having the evidence that aligns with that to demonstrate that when we put in whatever it is you're going to put in, or whatever service it is, that you can actually really deliver that value, and probably at quite a fast pace. And if it's going to make a cost saving, then when will that cost saving land? But yeah, in the interest of time, to make sure we get to all those bits, sort of my question after that was a push around innovation at the moment. So medtech is really, I think, at the forefront of that, and we see a huge amount new technologies embracing AI. It'd be really great to sort of understand what you think is happening in the policy environment, and is it keeping up with it? How can companies best align there?
Yeah, so I think innovation is a perennial topic that is of interest certainly to our members, and it's something that I know the NHS has grappled with for quite some time. And to hear, again, folks have been doing this with the NHS for longer than I have, I think really one of the things that they're almost always talking about, but it sometimes isn't said, is what companies are really concerned with is innovation adoption. I hear companies saying all the time, look, I can be as innovative as I want. I can even succeed in getting that innovative product onto an NHS framework, but I can't make them adopt it. And yeah. I think, the sort of glass half empty view that I've heard expressed several times is, yeah, the NHS loves innovation that's tried, tested, cheap, universally available, and is essentially a commodity. Which is an oversimplification, but I think does capture industry's frustration to a degree. I think the good news is, however, that you've got now so for instance, within the Department of Health and Social Care, there is the Medtech Directorate, and this is effectively a sort of internal policy think tank. And the Medtech Directorate is headed by a gentleman who was the head of procurement for Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospital Trust, one of the largest London hospital trusts. And so really understands from the procurement point of view how difficult is the challenge of driving innovation adoption. I think that what companies can do is take advantage of the existing NHS approaches to innovation. So for instance, I'm thinking of things like the NHS Accelerated Access Collaborative. This is again, a program that we can tell you more about if that doesn't ring a bell. And this is a collaborative effort of NHS England, Allied Health, what used to be called AHSNs. Rob, you're going to have to remind me. I know that they've changed their name.
The Academic Health Science Networks, but I think they're becoming Health Innovation Networks soon.
I think exactly so. With an eye toward underscoring the importance of innovation. So that a process exists whereby companies can register their product, as innovative, and bring it to the attention of the I guess, for lack of a better word, the NHS buying public. But I think the thing for companies to do is to come with as much data as possible, right? Yeah, this is always easy. Some of our members work in areas. I'm thinking here of stoma and continence products, right, where the N of your statistical sample is not ever going to be big enough to present randomized controlled data or something really statistically valid. I think we and other trade associations have succeeded, and it's going to take the next 2 or 3 years to figure out, whether we've really succeeded in getting government in the form of DHSC, in the form of NICE, in the form of MHRA, in the form of the NHS to realize that there are other ways, whether that's pre-market data, whether it's post-market data, there are things other than just randomized controlled trials. So I think coming armed with the data is an important piece. I think coming armed with an understanding of your company's definition of innovation is also important. Innovation,
absolutely.
when people bring up innovation, I'm always tempted right off the bat to just completely halt the conversation and say, what do you mean by that? Because
absolutely, yeah. You ask two people and you get three answers.
exactly. And I think, again, at the risk of an antiquated term, I think NHS and DHSC are grasping the nettle right on this one and understanding that to be successful, and really BHTA, full disclosure, BHTA has not been backward in coming forward about what we consider to be a lack of performance on the NHS's part. So for instance, we asked a parliamentary question in 2021 about how many innovative technologies had been taken up through the NHS's immediately previous innovation adoption program, which was called Health Tech Connect. And the answer was, in the 12-month period about which we asked, which was 2020, 2021, 180 technologies have been submitted, 142 had been passed on to NHS supply chain, and 0 had been taken up.
Yeah.
Which is that's exactly the kind of thing that's crushing for, an R&D department at a UK, health tech manufacturer to hear. So I think, government is, we and other trade associations have worked hard to say, look, this is a sector that contributes 13.5 billion to the UK export economy alone, for instance. To the UK economy alone. 6 billion of that, or there's an additional 6 billion for UK health tech exports. So this is not, an industry that's small. So I think they're beginning to, understand that, the NHS needs to be a little bit more innovation friendly. I would say, and I suspect this might lead on to, one of your next questions. One of the things that's always important when thinking about innovation adoption is to think about making life as easy as possible for people in the procurement function to understand, why is this innovative and what makes this attractive. And I think the degree to which you can, make that easy for them is a very important thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're running out of time. So I think it's aligning that value proposition. A big part of what we do at the NHS sort of Mtech Access is NHS Insights and Interactions team is going and having those conversations with those key people and saying, what do you actually want to see? What evidence is going to make you engage it? If we have to get some of the clinical people in, let's get some clinical people in, so that when you bring that product to them, you already have those answers. Might be in a slightly different trust or whatever, but at least you're not sort of grasping for what you think they might want, but hopefully what they do want. So I guess I think we've got, if you've got a couple of or a minute to sort of go into sort of anything else that you'd like to talk about on value propositions, but then sort of moving into export and import implications. They're getting increasingly difficult. Obviously, no one likes the word Brexit, but it's omnipresent and has to be one of those nettles that is grasped. So any sort of quick remaining thoughts on the procurement side, and onto Brexit, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to close off the procurement and innovation discussion. One of the things that we and others are calling for is a single front door. Right, a unified information office led by DH, and a reorganization of health and social care procurement around the value-based procurement principles that we hear senior leaders at NHS England and NHS supply chain talk about, but seem to be a little thin on the ground when it comes to conversations with, for lack of a better word, the coalface procurement partners. Again, BHTA, if it's of interest to people on this call, has provided for its members, some toolkits that are aimed at helping people have that conversation. That is the value-based procurement principle conversation with NHS supply chain and other large commissioners. When it comes to export and reducing export barriers, as you rightly say, no one really wants to bring up the B word, but it seems clear that for our members, and I suspect for anyone listening today, what's really desired is a consistent, frictionless trading relationship between UK health and social care exporters and their global partners, especially the EU. I think, again, here, like sustainability and social value, we are fortunate to have three things that are in the public domain. The first of those is the 2025 UK border strategy, which is an HMG document. The second is the UK export strategy, which is a Treasury, I think, and BEIS, as it was, co-production. And then the UK single trade window consultation. And in those three documents, there are many principles that we think, if enacted properly, will actually deliver what UK exporters want. So whether that's the 12-point export plan as expressed in the export strategy, or whether it's a single trade window that that sees off some of the technology challenges that are currently bedeviling people at the border, we think that the tools are there. It's now just time to deploy them and use them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's really helpful. No one wants to say the B word, but unless you sort of take the steps and engage with how the policy is going to change, and that may it will continue to change probably for many years to come, then we will be able to address it. So I guess my last question for now, just to round it out, is what do you think could be on the horizon, maybe other than Brexit, that's coming down the track? Maybe just sort of a couple of things that medtech companies can just think about. Probably don't have to do anything yet, maybe, or maybe they do, but in a couple of years, what should they be looking out for?
So I think the role of AI is certainly something that medtech companies should be thinking about, probably already are thinking about. I think that, again, medtech companies probably have a unique opportunity in comparison to some other sectors to bring to the AI offer some of the clinical rigor that would have to be present in, let's say, innovative R&D on a medicine, or innovative R&D on R&D on an innovative medical device. I think the risk with AI is that a lot gets said, and it's sounds like a very sort of interesting, and it sounds like one of those things that everyone thinks, oh, I better pay attention to this. But I think medtech companies have perhaps a leg up on other industries at being able to hold AI up to the light of the critical examination that clinical developments have to undergo, that would put them ahead, right, in their ability to say to commissioners and government buyers, look, this will deliver actual benefits, and here's how. I think that's a very big piece. I think international regulatory harmonization, even though that's one of those phrases that should come with a warning, like do not operate heavy machinery while saying this phrase.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think to the degree that companies can understand, okay, our main markets are, let's say, Australia, the UK, and the US. I think keeping abreast of how those regulatory systems are either moving closer together or moving farther apart is a really important thing to keep an eye on. I think that some of the debate within MHRA and within the Department of Health, to a degree, I think there is an acknowledgement of the need not to reinvent the wheel, and to make things as harmonious as possible. What I think is difficult sometimes is that when you listen to lots and lots of these presentations, not just from MHRA but from other global regulators, when they talk about international harmonization, they usually adopt what I call the Wizard of Oz scarecrow pose and say, well, we're going to recognize the regulatory system from there, and everyone's pointing at a different regulatory system. And if you're harmony, I think is the thing to achieve. But the question is, if everyone's pointing at
who's
something,
harmony?
Who's actually responsible for saying, and this is the regulatory regime in which this device has been produced? Finally, I think that a clear understanding of supply chain has never been more important. And I think that we see successful companies in our membership building redundancies if they're manufacturers into their supply chain, whether that means, looking at different suppliers that you can sort of engage in a retainer-like relationship If you need, for instance, raw polyester, if you are a manufacturer who buys raw polyester by the mile, as some of our members do, it's good to have a number of different sources like that. And then my final plea, I guess, would be not to underestimate the employee value proposition hook that comes from taking a responsible sustainability and social value stance. I've talked to a lot of graduate programs, and although I envy absolutely no one entering the world of work right now, I think it's clear that the employee value proposition is going to have to take into account a company's approach to sustainability and social value, no matter how big or small that company is. And I think the opportunity really is here, to do something very positive about that, that will have virtuous effects, create a sort of virtuous circle at your company. Because if you want to work with the likes of the NHS, you're going to have to be doing these things anyway. Many companies either have been doing them or are doing them already. But I think those four things, if in the future gazing piece, I think it's those four things I would emphasize.
Thank you. It was really good. So thank you, Bill, for sharing your story at the start. And I think the policy insights that you brought today have been really useful for any medtech company looking to move forward. So there's a lot to think about there. For any and pretty much any companies looking to get into the NHS, if they're not thinking about and engaging with these topics, I think they'll find it much more difficult than if they can need to. Thank you to our audience today for listening. If you have any questions, or please do email them in, and we'll try and follow up on them if we didn't have time to cover them today. Just as one last final thought, Mtech Access is running a symposium event in this coming September. So for those of you who might be interested in hearing more about sort of the work that we do and sort of the things that the companies and the organizations that we're paired with, like Bill and the BHTA, then please do have a look at that. I think it's going to come through in some follow-up material. But yes, thank you again, Bill. That was a really great and insightful talk. And thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our work with the NHS or how we could support your market access goals, please email info@mtechaccess.co.uk or visit our website at mtechaccess.co.uk.